There's a passage in the Gemara, right? That makes note of exactly what you're talking about. This notion of healing on Shabbat. It's not a notion that's against the oral tradition. So Yeshua, in dialogue with, I'm not sure who those rabbis are exactly because the New Testament doesn't name them, but for anyone who's familiar with the oral tradition and rabbinic understanding in general, you would know that healing can take place on the Shabbat. And when Yeshua answered and he says, "For surely the Son of Man is the Lord of Shabbat, and the Shabbat was made for man and not man for Shabbat," that was actually echoed in the oral tradition itself. So that's why it's proper to know what the oral tradition says before we have anything to say about it. Because these one or two rabbis that he may have encountered, or it doesn't even say rabbis, but these one or two Pharisees that he may have encountered that took issue with it, who's to say, where their training was entirely? Because again, within the framework and context of the oral tradition, healing on the Shabbat is not against the Torah, right? Because the Shabbat, excuse me, was made for man and not vice versa, right? So we have the onus as the highest point of creation, man, that our life takes precedence over all, right? So it would be ludicrous to think that a rabbi would sit and say that if a Jew is bleeding out and because it's Shabbat, that he should stay there. That's ridiculous. So there's no rabbi that would have taught that. There's no Pharisee, which becomes the school from which we get the rabbinic tradition today from. None of them would have embraced that. So again, we don't know the names of the people that he encountered with, but I can tell you what the oral tradition says, and it certainly doesn't disagree with that. So I'm not sure why that's even mentioned because there's no conflict with that in the oral tradition itself.
Can I make a can I make a mention?
Uh, Rabbi Yuri and Brother Zion, if you
Yeah,
have a response, you can come back up behind.
yeah. What I wanted to say was that I want to clarify a few things about what we mean when we say the oral tradition. So I think Zion quoted a passage in the Gemara. It's not clear that Jesus would have known that. In fact, it's probably he wouldn't have known that information. Now, it's true that the rabbinic tradition we are familiar with emerged from the Pharisaic tradition. We know that bodies of rabbinic literature come from the first century and in and around the time of Jesus. We know that the Christian Bible authors are at least familiar with Pharisees, if not coming from a Pharisaic tradition as well. But I think we want to be careful when we say the oral tradition. Diving into the oral tradition helps us understand the life and times of Jesus. It does, and it doesn't. I think we can be a bit more precise. What was the oral tradition at that time? And what might we assume, therefore, that Jesus encountered, perhaps learned, perhaps taught? And then from that point, you can sort of see where everything evolves. But I would want us to be a bit more careful if we're doing a sort of step backwards, and where do we, the rabbinic tradition now, the people that, right, Jewish people now, where did that come from? The Talmud, the Mishnah, etc., right? Okay, so I just think we can be a bit more careful about that. The second thing, and then I'll land, is that even if you want to say that Jesus had some kind of access to the rabbinic tradition, which I think is probably true, the Christian Bible authors clearly are not accepting the rabbinic tradition as part of their following Jesus ministry, right? So that's another, I think, important aspect. Like, strikes me that if you're going to be a Christian according to the Christian Bible, in one way or another, you're going to end up pushing away the rabbinic tradition. So I just wanted to mention those two things. Thanks.
I would love to respond to the rabbi, if that's okay.
Yes, but
All right. So as I noted, first of all, the rabbi may not be familiar with me, and I'm certainly not familiar with him, so he may not know how well versed and how well experienced I am with the application and knowledge of the oral tradition in general. So let me just kind of reset for a moment and say this. Um, I understand the implications of what was said. I also understand the complexities within the way that I worded it. But it is clear to most who study the New Testament from the vantage point of already knowing what the oral tradition has to say, that the writers were clearly very familiar with it, right? So rabbis aren't arguing that the writers don't know the oral tradition that exists in their time. And let me be a little bit more meticulous now, since the rabbi, I guess, was a little perplexed as to which way I'm using oral tradition, right? Of course, when I'm saying oral tradition, I'm not referring to something that a much later rabbi such as the Rambam would be saying, because he doesn't obviously exist in the era of Yeshua, right? So I wouldn't be quoting from the Gaonic period, right, or the Rishonim. I'd be quoting from the Zugot, right, of which in first century and second century Common Era, one of the teachings that came down is that there's a person by the name of Yeshu, spoken of in the oral tradition, and his teacher is said to be Yehoshua ben Parakia. All right, and he is the second of a pair of rabbis that are ruling. They're known as the Zugot. The fifth, obviously, would be Hillel and Shammai. And so when I speak about Yeshua and his knowledge of the oral tradition per se, of course, I'm not speaking obviously of a chronology experience that he doesn't relate to. Obviously, I would hope that the rabbi would give me enough credit just based on what I said, that I probably know a little bit about a little bit, not to make such a silly mistake and assume that I'm fumbling the chronology in some way, and I'm actually subscribing that Yeshua and the New Testament in general is aware of what all the oral tradition that we know of today to say. That would actually be silly, and I'm certainly not saying that. But within the context of what I said, if we just place Yeshua at the era that he's placed, and we place the writing of the New Testament at the era that it's placed, then the oral tradition that exists in that time, they were clearly aware of much of it, right? For instance, even the title rabbi. There's a lot of things that are mentioned in the New Testament that a lot of people take for granted and don't really like wrap their mind around it completely in order to deeply delve into it to understand. The mere fact that Yeshua was attempted to be called rabbi more than once shows you that they understood, his lineage per se, because the Sadducees or the Zaddukim, they didn't use or evoke such a title. That title didn't exist among them. Their heads were not called Rav or Rabbi or Rabbi. They weren't called such names. Those names belong exclusively to the Pharisaic officers, right? And we know that not just from our immaterial culture, but also from the material culture, right? The artifacts. We know that those titles were distributed among the Pharisaic school. So that's why you see out of most of Yeshua's teachings, it mainly reflects the Pharisaic teaching, right? And that's why, again, out of his own mouth, if we're to charge that he spoke in Matthew 23 and 2, he's told his followers and the multitudes to follow the scribes and the Pharisees and do everything that they tell you, because they sit upon the seat of Moses, right? The seat of Moses, as an actual historical item, is a chair upon which the smartest person sits. And so, in saying that they sit upon the seat of Moshe, he's declaring their authority interpreting the scripture. Why would he be declaring that the Pharisees, those who gave birth to what we call today the oral tradition, how does he declare that they have authority on what Moses taught if he doesn't accept it himself? So, these are some of the clear underlying themes that present themselves. That, again, if you're not privy with the oral tradition, then yeah, it can escape you. But if you're very deeply immersed, then you know exactly what's going on. And this is not to say that he agreed with everything that they said, because obviously he challenges them, right? But no rabbi agrees with everything another rabbi says. For instance, it kind of sounded like the rabbi treated some of what I said contextually as if I'm saying something new and unique, as if Rabbi Shmuley Boteach's work, The Kosher Jesus, he doesn't say the same thing, right? Exactly verbatim what I said. So when he says that, I think we could be more careful in how we treat it. I just want to point into some obvious notable figures who are contemporary with us today, who are far more renowned than him, because I actually don't know his name, Rabbi Uri, and are saying the same thing I said, even verbatim. So I'm being very technical, and just to mind you, Rabbi, I'm a very technical speaker, and I'll end there.
So Zion, you're clearly well read, bright guy. I don't always count on that happening in these kinds of conversations. So I appreciate your erudition. I think I understand what you said. I think you understand what I said. I think we're cool. Um, what I find interesting is that I think it strikes me that some of the folks that you mentioned who say exactly the same thing as you have said are saying it to Christians who say, "Oh no, we reject that," and their argument is, "No, Jesus actually was much more Jewish." And then the phenomenon on of sort of taking that you know that interaction and then saying, "Aha, so now to be better, if we identify as Israelites and also followers of Jesus, how would we go about doing that?" Right. So like this sort of Christian Israelite phenomenon is just interesting to me. So all good as far as I'm concerned, Zion.
All right, I appreciate that. And just for the record, if I could let you know, I am not a Christian. I do not accept Yeshua as the Mashiach. I am a person that follows the Torah and the Tanakh alone, although I have grown to come to a greater understanding of what Yeshua had to say, his message, and I do see many parts of his narrative as more plausibly accurate in light of newer information that I've been looking at. But if we were to scrutinize, my beliefs, I place my beliefs on the Torah and the Tanakh, the oral tradition. I do not believe that the Mashiach has come, yet in my newest research, I am highly considering the plausibility of Yeshua's narrative in light of having access to what the rabbis were saying during his era and before his era. So I'm pretty much an interesting Israelite for you. I can assure you this: you're probably
We're
not going to
all
meet another one like me.
I was gonna say that sounds like a first of all, best of luck on your path and your journey. Um, that sounds like a lot to be figuring out, and I wish you much success. And secondly, yeah, I don't think I've ever met anybody who sort of described it exactly as you have. Um, I I'm interested in sort of figuring out for myself as an educational proposition, like the broad, how diverse the Israelite community really is, and how many different kinds of identities there are. So, which is a long way to say, yeah, identity is complex. So I appreciate it. Yeah, I get you.